As Ben said, I am Sydney Heifler, and I'm a PhD student in the history department here at OSU. I primarily research romance comics, which you can see there. They're a lot of fun. And I also make comics, which are decidedly not romantic. This is my 4th year organizing the grad student roundtable for CXC, which I sometimes moderate. I'm so honored to work with CXC to help showcase grad student research here at OSU. And thank you to everyone who showed up here today to hear about grad student work. I'm also really grateful to the students who take time out of their busy class schedule to participate in this panel. I know what that's like. With that in mind, I'm now going to very briefly introduce our panelists and then give them an opportunity to introduce themselves further and explain their work before jumping into questions. But could you please come up here and sit in your chairs? They're so great. I am really excited about today's lineup. So we have Shaheen Beardsley. Could you please raise your hand thank you. He is a cartoonist based in Columbus, Ohio. He is an MFA candidate in the art department here. Shaheen has been working on a comic series called Oh Boy Comics. Did I pronounce that? Yeah, okay. Since 2015, Oh Boy serves as a kind of imaginary proxy for the author, interrogating personal experiences regarding body image. And Sam Risak, raise your hand please, is a PhD candidate concentrating in health and humanities in the English department, and she focuses on addiction narratives in comics. She completed her first novel over the summer, very impressive, and she is the creative nonfiction and graphic essays editor for Sweet, a Literary Confection. Peter Smyth, you don't have to raise your hand, is located in the art history department. They study cartooning as a drawing style and philosophy, building on theoretical traditions developed by art historians and challenging traditional comic studies theories. Okay, so now you're gonna go, I put you in alphabetical order. Sorry if that doesn't feel comfortable, but you're going to describe your work and maybe introduce yourself a bit further if you so feel like it, and just tell me when you want me to go to the next slide. So.
Yeah, so I'm Shaheen Beardsley. I'm a cartoonist here at OSU. What am I? I don't know what to say. Yeah, so I'm in the printmaking department in the art department. The first cartoonist student that they've accepted into the art department. I think something of a guinea pig, the Billy Ireland long-standing institution here at OSU, and I think it's been a long time since the art department has decided to have anyone who does visual, like narrative work. Let's see, I've been in art school forever, since I was like 14, and for most of it, art school makes you think that you need to pretend to be smart or just be smart. But it made me feel like I needed to pretend to be smart. And then quickly into my undergraduate studies, I realized that the thing I grew up with and loved the very most is the thing that I should just be honest and love and do. So yeah, I made this character that came out of, a lot of teenage angst, and then subsequently adult angst, which is different. So, it evolves along with me, but it's infantile and immature and funny. I hope that it's really funny. That's the idea. My character's an idiot. And a lot of it is it's also like an homage to comics. I think it's a love story to comics. It's really silly and referential all the time. This is my Spider-Man, I have tons of Spider-Man in there. The character's conception is kind of like a backwards Spider-Man. He kills his own uncle, and then doesn't learn the right lesson about it. He doesn't learn the right lesson about anything. Next slide. This is a comic that I made last year in the art department. I used the art department's Risak printer to do this. It was a silly little short thing about the hubris of being stupid. That's a lot of what it's all about. Yeah, next slide. He loves country music too. And he loves being naked. Just like and he poops, like normal people. But then he also does stuff like bad normal people. He smokes too much and he drinks a lot. And he doesn't really care about anything except for maybe like taking a nap. But he gets superpowers, so yeah.
Wait, sorry, did you want me to go?
Yeah, next slide. We'll go through. Yeah, my passion in life is drawing, I think, on top of anything else in the whole world. I love drawing more than anything. And yeah, it's a funny struggle to press forward in an academic setting. It's hilarious and fun and very cool. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, next, Sam, you are up.
Okay, yeah. Hi. Wait, I don't know. Do you have to lean forward? This is record. That's confusing.
Oh, we talking to this one? Oh.
Okay, wait. So my hair from this. All right. Okay. Well, I'm Sam. Also, Shaheen didn't mention, but he's also an excellent teacher. I did not finish his class because I was taking 5 classes, which turned out to be too much. But in the few weeks that I was there, it was very fun and very engaging. So just wanted to say that. But yes, I'm Sam.
I appreciate that.
I actually came to comics through my creative writing background. I have my MFA in creative writing. I just finished my novel. But it's always funny to me when people talk about comics as sort of this underappreciated field, or at least in terms of like academic prestige, which it totally is. I see that. But from the creative writing side of things, I mean, we admire comics so much. Like that's how I was first came to OSU for it, because it's like the idea of being able to write that, and then also all the labor that goes into images. I don't know. I first got into comics reading like the graphic memoirs like Alison Bechdel and Linda Barry, and it was just like blew my mind how impressive these were. So I decided to study comics at OSU, and I sort of combined my interests with comics with health humanities, and specifically in the field of narrative medicine. So next, yeah. So basically narrative medicine is just the idea of how do we humanize medicine. Obviously medical students have to study a lot of coursework, learn anatomy and lots of complicated things, but medicine is also, you have to work with people, right? It's not just about like diagnosing someone and treating you like all of your answers can come out of a textbook, because that's just not the way it is. So narrative medicine looks at like how we can use literature to sort of like teach these stories and help physicians hopefully treat patients like human beings. Yeah, I'm not going to read it. I just have a bunch of extra information up here. So the signature method in narrative medicine is the close reading, which is basically what we all do in literature classes. Like you get a passage and then you close read it, you try to analyze it, figure out, what is this really trying to say? How is it saying it? But specifically in narrative medicine, as opposed to looking at, how is this use of metaphor operating? You're trying to get students to connect what's happening to the story to their real life experiences so that they have a better understanding of how to work with people in real life. So next slide. So my question was, how can we implement comics into narrative medicine? And it's not that it doesn't already exist. Graphic medicine is already a huge field in and of itself. But my question was specifically not only how do we get students to look at comics, but what would the benefit be of having them respond to comics through comics form? Because one of the critiques against narrative medicine is this idea that basically it promotes this idea of closure that doesn't exist in real life. Like you're still kind of trying to come up with an answer. Like I'm looking at this literary passage and I'm going to write a paragraph that like solves the passage. But with comics, it's a much more expressive form, much more open-ended. So I wanted to see, what if we have students engage with comics and then respond to it in this comics form? So no, keep that slide. I wasn't sure what was up there. So I worked with Dr. Jim Phelan, who's the head of the narrative program at OSU and just a huge figure in general. But he has a class that is at the medical school here called what is it called? From Page to Bedside? Am I saying it right? Do I have it up there? Okay, yes, sorry. But so it's a class of all medical students, and it's kind of untraditional. They just have to take 8 classes throughout the duration of their medical school. But every month, a student picks a text, and then everyone in the class responds to it, does a close reading, and then there's a discussion. And I observed some of these classes, and then so I worked with Dr. Phelan to do one myself. So I chose the graphic memoir Impossible People, which deals with addiction. And so the students, they read it, and then they first responded to it through text at home as they normally would. And then in class, I had them pick a passage, and they could do the same one that they responded through text, or they could choose a different one, but they responded through comics, and then we sort of compared what the differences were. So, next slide. So the results of the study, one, I was surprised that they were so unfamiliar with comics. A lot of them had never even read a graphic memoir ever. So that was interesting, but it was also really nice to see how they were making a lot of the same connections through comics that they were through text, but that environment in the classroom felt a lot more lighthearted. They felt, I don't know, they didn't feel like the same sort of pressure that they would to seem like really serious as they were with the text. And what else? So you can do the next slide. Yeah, so oh, and that's like one of the primary issues too with narrative medicine is these students already have so much coursework. How do we then get to have them prioritize humanities classes? But in this experiment, it didn't feel like work to them in the same way. Like they were still doing the analysis, but they were able to draw, they were able to express themselves in a lot of ways that they weren't able to do with their other medical coursework. So I felt like that, I didn't even expect that necessarily, but that was like a really pleasant surprise. It's like, oh, we can, if we get the same results that we do with text, but in a way that feels enjoyable to them, we might actually get students to want to do this. So well, I'm good for next. Okay, so these are just examples. So like comic 1, he's just saying like, wow, she's really hit rock bottom, like commenting on the narrative of the graphic memoir. And then he's like looking at what a mess his life is. And then he's saying like, glad I'm not her, but obviously making the comparison that he does make a lot of the same mistakes. Okay, next slide. We're not gonna read all this, but I just wanted to show, this is like what the same student's text response looked like. So it's much more academic, a lot more serious, and a lot, I don't know, required a lot more time from him. Okay, and then example 2. And then this is just like another student. And so they're just, impossible people are less impossible with friends, because the memoir is very much about the importance of connection. And then go next slide. And then again, super long, like not fun. Okay. And then do I have any more slides?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So yeah, this is just like the implications. So it's not a one-for-one substitute. There were some critical analysis that was happening in the text that you wouldn't get through comics, but I do feel like there is a role for both. Like this sort of expressionism, the creative outlet, provides a lot of benefits in comics that we're not seeing otherwise in narrative medicine. Okay. I feel like I already said it. That's fine. We're good.
Peter, are you ready?
Yeah, I can go. My name is Peter Smyth. I'm a PhD student in the History of Art department. Right now I'm in art history, but I started in an art setting. I went to art school. I was making comics in art school, and I got interested in them sort of intellectually. I wanted to know how they worked. You can go to my first slide. And at that time, when I was first getting interested in comics, the question that drove me was this relationship between comics and art, more specifically comics and painting. And at this time, this review is 2016, I was an undergrad at that time, to pose the question of comics and art was to pose the question of cultural value, which is to say the question, are comics art? And I think Shute was right to say in 2016 that was already a boring question. Certainly today it's a boring question. We know that comics are art. But I also felt engaging with this kind of work that to frame the question in this way as just a question of cultural value was to limit the kind of conversation we can have about that relationship. And I had 2 inklings as to why there might be more to say about this beyond the idea of cultural value. The first inkling was I had this sense that cartoonists, broadly speaking, and painters, broadly speaking, didn't really get along. There are exceptions to this. There are painters who make comics and cartoonists who paint, and sometimes they like each other's work. But broadly speaking, I feel like the comics world and the art world are sort of at odds. They don't really mesh. And I wanted to know why that was. If comics are art, then why does it still feel like there's this tension? And the second inkling is that when I started actually looking into art history, I found pretty quickly that art historians pretty much across the board don't write about comics, aren't interested in comics, don't think of comics as within the purview of art history. And I wanted to know why that was. You can go to my next slide. I first thought that I would locate the source of this tension by looking at this kind of broad history, the transition from modernism into postmodernism. Often when we talk about this tension between the two worlds, we focus on this moment in the early 1960s when painters like Lichtenstein and Warhol appropriate imagery from comic books and other sources and use them in their paintings, and then how that moment in the early 1960s is litigated in the following decades by cartoonists, especially by Art Spiegelman, who seems to have really hated this work. I at first thought that the postmodern narrative that postmodernism collapsed the difference between high art and low art was maybe wrong. I was suspicious of that narrative. It seemed like there was work coming out of comic scholarship that questioned that narrative. Certainly Bart Beatty, who we saw on the previous slide, questions that narrative. But the more I looked into this, the more it seemed like that actually was a good narrative, and more recent comic scholarship. Like there's a good article by Hugo Frey and Jan Baetens that argues that, in fact, pop art broadly raised the appeal of comics in public estimation, actually helped us see them as art, even if it seems kind of patronizing from our perspective. It actually raised comics and probably had a net positive effect. So when I realized that that was kind of a dead end, pursuing the question from that angle, I thought I would look at how comic scholars, as our discipline was being founded, constructed our object, how we understood our object, the comic strip, what we look at, what we see as important, what we focus on. So I went back to Kunzel, and Kunzel's history of the comic strip is sort of the first in-depth history of comics. And what's interesting about Kunzel is he has an art history background. His dissertation advisor was this very eminent art historian, Ernst Gombrich. Gombrich is the kind of person that you read in an art history methods class. He's a very important figure in the field. And Gombrich actually wrote pretty extensively on caricature, wrote several essays. He has an unfinished book project on caricature. And he even in that work makes the claim that Topfer was the progenitor of the modern comic strip. And as far as I know, he's the first person to make that claim. So there's this alternate universe where Kunzel could have founded a history of the comic strip in an art historical context. He could have continued his teacher's work. But what he ends up doing is when he writes these books, he foregrounds the narrative element of comics. He defines comics as a narrative form. And obviously it makes sense that he would do that. Comics are a narrative form. But what that ends up meaning, the consequences of that, is that he adopts this very mechanistic approach to the interpretation of images. He foregrounds a narrative, so interpreting images is just sort of the means of getting to what's actually interesting to him, which is the narrative. And this is really evident when he talks about a canonical artist, like someone like Hogarth. He has to make the distinction between Hogarth the artist and Hogarth the narrator. And he's interested in Hogarth the narrator. He's not really interested in Hogarth the artist. And Kunzel's an art historian, so he still could competently talk about Hogarth the artist and understand that version of Hogarth. But he's going to focus on Hogarth the narrator. And, what actually happened, we know, is that the study of the comic strip did not continue in an art historical context. It moved into a literary context. And now most of the people that write about comics, certainly from a broad theoretical perspective, do it in English departments. And the people that do it generally have English degrees. And I think it's partly, maybe a lot to do with this fact that comics had to be sort of dislocated from an art historical perspective into a literary one so that we could focus on the narrative. And a kind of unexamined consequence of that fact is that we have adopted this very mechanistic approach to the interpretation of images. You can go to the next slide. And I think that mechanistic approach is kind of expressed in the things that we say about cartoons as images. Think about some of the things we say, that cartoons focus our attention on an idea. Scott McCloud says that. That we are not meant to look at cartoons, but read them. Chris Ware says that. That it's harder not to read them than it is to read them, to paraphrase this thing that we all say about Nancy. These all imagine that the kind of juncture between visual form and represented object is kind of transparent, as if we just sort of intuitively made that leap and that we all made that leap in the same way. Art historians don't imagine that that is an intuitive kind of relationship. A lot of weird and interesting things happen at that sort of junction between form and iconographic meaning or represented object, the literal thing that the lines and the shapes represent. And because we've had that mechanistic approach to interpreting images, we tend to gloss over that. And my work is trying to draw our attention back to that sort of base level of what it means to look at an image, and how looking at cartoons is different from looking at other kinds of images. And then my last slide is Caroline Cash Nancy. And that's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay, just to quickly check with Caitlin, when are we supposed to end?
10:50, right, Ben?
Okay, just don't want to go.
I'll give you the battle aid.
Oh, okay, cool. So I'm gonna start with one question, and then I'm gonna see if the audience has any questions, and if not, I will ask more questions. But please do come up with questions. So you're all talking about boundaries in your work, and you're all exploring breaking boundaries within comics and in your respective fields. And I wanted to know more, as someone who's in the department with very strict boundaries, what's it like to navigate your work within the department as grad students and teachers, because some of you teach. Yeah, just you look like you want to say something, Peter, so go ahead.
I mean, there are people in my department, like faculty, who will proudly say that they've never read a comic.
Never.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say most people in the Department of Art have also share that sentiment, and I think that to the original question that you are interrogating, are comics art? I think that there's a as the cartoonist at the table speaking for all comics, I feel like comics don't want to be art, because I don't know. I think that there's something inherently about art that is, to me, and I know this is it's a little extreme, but I feel like it's inherently hypocritical. I think that the fine art world, especially the fine art world as we look at it, as far as post-war modernism, ended up creating this world that became increasingly more elitist while trying to express the exact opposite. I mean, art is always trying to take on capitalism and hierarchies and social hierarchies, and then more often than not ends up in huge galleries that are eaten up by whatever kind of literati and controlled by all these hands with so much money, and it's just crazy. Whereas comics are for people who want to read them and can afford a book for $5. As opposed to a piece of poop that's $5 million. I don't know, whatever. But so that being said, I think that my contempt for my subtle contempt for the modern art world is difficult in an art department, because I think that I come at it from an anti-intellectual position, and that's because I want to make art that people can engage with easily without having a PhD or $1 million or whatever. So it becomes a little bit difficult, I think, also being the first comics student in a department like that, and no one quite knows what to do with you, especially when I'm not trying to breach the boundary. So it's interesting.
Yeah. So you said you're the first comic student in the art department?
In at least in the graduate program.
Wow.
I think there are a lot of undergraduates who are interested in comics. I think that again, like to my point more, I would say that like most undergrads in most art departments all over the country in any art school are probably really interested in comics. That is like always the trend that I find. And then usually it's the faculty who can't reach them there unless they're in a school or program like here or other places that I've been to that have cartoonists and illustrators like working in the program. But yeah, I feel like more young people want to get into comics, and then more older artists are like. But so I'm the first in the graduate department.
That's great.
Yeah.
Sam, you're in the English department, which I know has a bit more comics people in it, but still English can be very defined by boundaries. So.
Yeah, well, speaking to Shaheen's point a little, when I was looking at MFA programs too, because comics are taught with esteem in creative writing classrooms, but there's like no faculty teaching, because that was something I was looking for. So I do feel like that's interesting, because it's like, if there's no faculty out there, then how can you get a degree in it that's like specializing to then, make a place for it in academia? But in terms of English departments, I feel like I've actually been pretty fortunate with my ability to push boundaries. I feel like I always do. Like for my master's thesis, I did a comic like as part of that, and I got warm reception from two faculty members who were both on the English department, and then the other faculty member who was in the department, I think he was in, I was looking at Japanese comics, so I think he was in the Japanese department there, but yeah, he almost didn't pass me. And this master's, I will say, went on to be featured in the Journal of American Folklore, so it was a good thesis, but he was very, I know, I'm still a little bitter, but he was very strict, and that was a moment where I was like, oh, I might have tried to push boundaries too far. But then coming back to OSU, I do feel like in the English department, sometimes the language that we're using to describe comics feels a little, I have resistance to it too, because it feels too academic, and it feels like it's taking an accessible medium and then making it not accessible, which I feel is frustrating. I also feel like it's frustrating just with creative writing in general. But at the same time, I've expressed my desire to make my research very accessible. My dissertation will be narrative driven. It will be readable by public audiences, not just academic scholars. And I've received, at least so far, no pushback on that. So I feel like, yeah, English, we're doing okay.
To be fair, I've enjoyed researching comics and through history, and I found some of the boundaries useful for pushing questions, but I also like making scholarship accessible. But okay, so audience, do you have questions? You have not? Yes, we do. We have a lot. Okay, I'm gonna go with the person in the striped shirt first.
What comic, cartoonists, and comics have influenced you? Can you please repeat the question?
Can you re-ask that?
Huh?
Can you repeat your question?
What cartoonists and what comics have influenced?
Okay, so what comics and cartoonists have influenced you in your work?
I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Chris Ware. I didn't find his comics in undergrad and to read what he had to say about them. I think I wanted to be an animator when I started undergrad, and then I read Jimmy Corrigan and I changed my mind.
My list is huge. I was just actually talking to an undergraduate student who had reached out to me from somewhere else, and he was like, do you have a list of them? And I was like, oh, I can't think of many. Let me send you that off the top of my head. And it was, I had to fit it in 3 Instagram messages. I would say that the cartoonist who really changed my direction and made me snap about maybe the way I was organizing stuff and writing, definitely Daniel Klaus. I mean, I know, basic. But really, that was the best to me. But favorite cartoonist overall right now, for sure, no question, is Christophe Blain, the French cartoonist. Yeah, absolutely the best. Oh yeah, I will.
Probably Alison Bechdel. I feel like my greatest appreciation for comics is just the ability to use comedy to make difficult topics accessible and get a conversation going. I didn't talk about that too much, but that was very much about what my study in the classroom was too. That memoir, Impossible People, highly recommend. It is hilarious, and it does a great job of making topics like addiction not so heavy that you can actually talk about them. And I just think, I have a super dark sense of humor, so it makes things, it's the best coping mechanism there is, I think.
Thank you.
Yes, the man in the plaid.
I have a question for Sam. I've always been kind of interested in the graphic medicine, kind of as like a genre in itself. My question is about accessibility and use of those comics. In other words, how are they being used? Are they being prescribed to patients? Are the patients kind of like finding them on their own? Are there places where they're available online so that people can read them? I'm just curious as to how they get in the hands of people that are dealing with specific ailments. And also, is there a part of graphic medicine that is doctors telling their stories as well? And where are those found? I think there's like a repository, Columbia, where there's a whole bunch of them there. So I'm just kind of curious, like what, when we talk about graphic medicine and getting in the hands of people, are we strictly talking about books, or are there websites, or how is the genre expressed for people and how do they get it?
Oh, okay. So first, graphic medicine, for everyone who doesn't know, it's a field of comics studies and comics making in which comics are used to both like educate patients, for patients to express things about their own journey. It's about making all these things more accessible to people, and they're often used as tools. And the question was about how in graphic medicine and in comics making, how are comics used with patients and how are they accessed? It's like a very shorthand version of the question. Sorry if it wasn't exactly what you asked. But Sam, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think I might end up directing it to you because it's obviously graphic medicine is like a very large field. My interest is primarily like narrative medicine began at medical schools as Rita, actually I still never know, is it Sharon or Karen? I pronounce it different every time I say it. Do you know?
What school?
CHA, Columbia.
Oh, Karen.
Karen, okay. Rita Karen, who started it. It began as a field working specifically with like medical students in order to, improve their interactions with patients. And that is the field that feels, I don't know, like I guess that I could have like the most say in because I would like to go on to teach. There are fields like applied comics, which are more about actually working with like patients and getting them to tell their stories through comics, but that isn't a field that I have researched. Do you know more?
So my comics, I make them in the field of graphic medicine, and they're about PTSD and how like people experience PTSD and how people can better serve people with PTSD, especially women. But I've been to a lot of graphic medicine conferences, and there are a lot of websites, and there are a lot of like surgeons and doctors creating online comics too, and animated comics too. Especially, there was a really cool presentation in which a surgeon and a comics maker worked out a program to teach children about the cancer that they were dealing with. And so there's all sorts of ways that it's done. It's also Graphic Memoir has it, but your work definitely fits in the field of graphic medicine. And I was actually harassing Sam before the panel, being like, you have to go to a graphic medicine conference with me. So yes.
We'll go.
The one with the red sweater, I think, in the back.
Hi. I have a question for Sam. So I'm interested in knowing how you got to engage the students to draw comics. Like, did you give prompts? Did you have to do like a separate tutoring and class to like introduce them to comics, the forms of comics, and also how did you actually get them expressing what they want to express?
So the question is, how do you get students to engage with comics in your classrooms and get them to express what you wanted them to express?
Yeah, so I had a limited amount of time because I could only use one class period because like I was explaining, the way the class is set up, each student in order to graduate has to lead their own session. So the class is like 3 hours. So in order to encompass the discussion and everything had to be shortened. Maybe in a bigger class, I would do more of a tutorial on comics, but basically they had read the text. They'd already engaged with it by responding through text. And so then in class, I did just give like a very brief rundown of like what comics are. I provided a sample comic of one that I made and sort of just like went through the decisions. But I only gave them 10 minutes in class to do the assignment. And that was intentional too, because I didn't want them to focus too much on making the perfect comic, because that's really not the point. In narrative medicine, like I was explaining, even when they're doing a written response, it doesn't really matter if they have all the literary background. The importance is like their ability to connect with the story that's happening on the page. And even though they didn't have familiarity with comics as a medium. I mean, it is around us anyways. Like, I mean, they've at least seen superhero comics, or they've at least seen, the comics that are in the newspapers. So it is something that like subconsciously they had like an awareness of. And that is the nice thing to, obviously, to make like, Shaheen or Peter's comics or any of the ones that we've talked about, that's so much labor, but on a simplistic form, like most people can do like a stick figure comic. And for our purposes, that's all that they really needed. So yeah, I just gave them like a brief explanation of like the conventions of comics, how, you express emotion, things like that. Gave them an example of one that I had created. And then I was like, all right, we only have 10 minutes. These are not going to be perfect. Don't stress too much. Just like do what you can. And I think that time limit, because like no one, even people who are more talented at drawing, it's like no one's going to make an amazing comic in 10 minutes. So it's like they were more at ease to share with one another anyways.
Yes. The only person raising their hand.
For the artists, can't you hit the academics with somebody like Ad Reinhardt and shut them up about it? The question is comics art it's a boring question, and there are moderns that made comics, and Ad Reinhardt was no serious of them. And wouldn't that be? Have you tried that? Wouldn't that be a good club?
There's too many pee-pees and poo-poos and butts in my comic for any argument to really try.
You're a field that celebrates canned shit, right? It's that's an important artwork in the canon.
No, I mean, there are plenty of cartoonists who take themselves super seriously, and I think, again, me having said that, comics don't want to be art, within myself, I do very much believe that comics are art. They are an art form, but
Certainly some people do want them to be art.
Right, and also
and
people
aspire
do
to that sort of high feeling that, the fine arts inspire.
Yeah. But, there are all these, weird ways that we also I compartmentalize, art, and then capital A art, and then comic art, and I don't know, it's all over the board. But I think that I'm not trying to defend myself. I am just trying to be myself. So
But just to follow up, the exhibition that's at the Center Pompidou right now.
Yeah.
The top floor is this heavily curated
Well,
art show. The floor below it, that I don't think gets as much attention, they actually interspersed original comic art with pieces of the collection.
Well, we're not France. If I lived in France or Japan or Italy or, oh my gosh, Brazil, anywhere that wasn't here, generally comics are considered more. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm trying.
Yeah.
I'm trying.
I think we've established that it's getting better, but there's still resistance, especially in certain areas. But yeah, France is very, very welcoming. Yes.
My question is a little bit more basic. So you've been talking a bit about cartooning in literature departments and in the art department, and et cetera. When I went to undergrad, we had a really extensive illustration program, and it was separate from the painting program and separate from the graphic design program. It was kind of this weird interspersal, and I wanted to ask about that relationship to the comic arts and illustration departments, because in my head, and maybe this is just because of the school that I attended, it was kind of all sort of this weird, blurry, mushy situation.
What school was it?
Oh, it was Grand Valley State University.
Okay, yeah.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat your question a little bit shorter so I can repeat it to the audience?
Yeah. I'm asking about the relationship of illustration programs and departments with the comic.
Okay,
arts.
so the question is, how does illustration departments and programs intersect with comic arts? And you have 2 minutes to answer.
Okay, so I was in an illustration program, and they tied very, very closely. I did illustration because I didn't want to be part of a fine art program and have those kind of conversations, and I wanted to. Comics is I think that separation is also that drawing as a craft, and I think that a lot of fine art is no, doesn't matter. But so I was in an illustration department, and that was where I met a lot of professional cartoonists. Most illustration departments house cartoonists as instructors who are also freelance, because a lot of cartoonists are also doing freelance illustration. And now the undergraduate program that I went to has a comics minor, and it evolved out of the illustration department. So they go very hand in hand. OSU does not have illustration. And here I'm in printmaking because there is not an illustration. There's not something close enough to what I could have done painting and drawing too, but printmaking, I just felt making books, making comics, that's printmaking. Yeah.
I think conceptually the difference that's often drawn between illustration and comics or cartooning is that a comic is sort of narratively independent. The story that it tells isn't external to it. Illustration is often talked about in terms of dependency. It illustrates something that's external to it.
Also, maybe it has more commercial dependency.
Sometimes.
Like a
I am so sorry, but I have to now end this panel.
Oh, that is.
So that we can clear out. I got the warning sign. But yeah, let's give a round of applause to our wonderful grad students. Yeah.